Welcome to the University of Houston. My name is Jim Granato, and I'm the Dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs. I'm very excited for this unique opportunity to bring together public policy leadership, students and alumni from across Texas for an insightful conversation on working together toward good governance, good policy, and investing in the next generation to tackle tomorrow's most pressing challenges. I want to thank Dean DeShazo and his team from the University of Texas for knocking on our door with the idea of engaging at a deeper level. I want to thank those in the audience like University of Houston Provost Diane Chase, Hobby School Advisory Board Member Beth Robertson, Judge Ed Emmett, for being here today. We know they believe in our mission and our work. I hope this is the first of many opportunities to collaborate and amplify our positive impact on public service through education, research, civic engagement, and leadership development. And now, Dean DeShazo.
Thanks so much, Jim. So I'm J.R. DeShazo. I'm Dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. It's great to be with you all this evening. And it's my charge to just sort of explain why we're here. And it seemed like a good idea to get together the leaders of the major schools and institutes in Texas that focus on the development of public policy and the development of public leaders, both within the state and across the South, and nationally here in Texas. And so, as Dean Granato mentioned, we hope that this convening evolves over time to meet the needs of our educational communities, that we're tonight going to be talking about questions like how can we collaborate, learning really about each other and what are the programs, what are the research opportunities, how can we support state public agencies and nonprofit leaders within Texas. I think we all recognize that this is a moment of tremendous need when it comes to supporting government at all levels and training the next generation of public leaders. And so that's what you're going to hear us focusing on today and this evening. So thank you all for being here. And I want to thank Dean Jodi Sandfort for traveling from the University of Washington and the Evans School to be here and serve as our moderator. When I saw that we had this opportunity, I thought of her immediately, and I was very grateful. As always, she's had a bit of a circuitous day in terms of air travel, but we're grateful you made it, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I have just come in from Seattle, but said yes because I think when we can gather in community to think about the kinds of policy education that we need for this moment, there's no more important conversation. And I think we're really fortunate there's a diverse array of people in the room who have a lot of different commitments to these policy schools in Texas. So I think we'll have a nice conversation this afternoon and then have a reception so we can speak more informally in that context as well. As I understand it, the reason why we have mics in front of us is that this is being recorded for audio and podcasts so that people who aren't here can hear it as well, and some video. So my charge, and I should say that Ambassador David Satterfield will be joining us. He was delayed because he had a medical appointment. So at some point in the next few minutes, he'll sneak in and sit right in the middle of the table with us. But I wanted to start actually and ask the panelists, and we'll start with Michael Adams, who is at the Jordan Leland School at Texas Southern University, to talk a little bit about the nature of their public policy programs. One of the things that's quite interesting in our field is that some of our schools were started many, many years ago. Some of the first public administration schools were founded about 100 years ago. And then some of them changed in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s into public policy schools. We come from a variety of traditions, and so I'd like people to talk a little bit about the school, the origins, and what are some of the programmatic things that they're grappling with to just kind of level set for us who's going to be in the conversation this afternoon.
Right.
So, Michael.
All right. Greetings, everyone. Michael Adams. I'm your neighbor from across the street. Well, the modern, I guess, version of the Barbara Jordan Mika Leland School came about in the 70s when Senator well, actually it was the 80s, Senator Rodney Ellis. They wanted to have a public policy school named in the honor of Barbara Jordan and Mickey Leland. And that school was created. We have essentially 3 programs. We have a public policy program where we offer an undergraduate degree in public affairs and a master's in public administration that is accredited by NASPA. And we have an executive component of the MPA program as well. And then we have what we call an administration of justice program, which is essentially criminal justice, including an undergraduate master's program and also a PhD in administration of justice. And lastly, we have an urban planning and environmental policy program. And that program concentrates more so on planning, but we have recently created what we call the Bullard Center on Environmental Policy and Environmental Justice. And as a result, I guess, in the change with the presidential administration, that center has gotten a lot of federal funding in recent years. Yeah. And so that's the program. And we also have 2 research institutes. The Barbara Jordan Institute, which is a part of the Barbara Jordan Archives that we house on our campus in the library. And we have the Mickey Leland Center on World Hunger and Peace. And I'll talk more about those contributions later. Thank you.
So the Hobby School is about 5 years old. It evolved from what was called the Center for Public Policy, which its mission was basically to do surveys and do regional economic forecasting. And over time, it evolved into a school, partly because of the relation with Governor Hobby. Governor Hobby was known for being a data fanatic. So part of our first core idea in developing the school was we wanted to have a very strong quantitative training program. But over the course of developing the business plan for the school, we realized we wanted to have a couple other things that Governor Hobby thought would also matter. The second component would be ethics. Ethics in research, but also understanding why people disagree. Some people put more weight on equality and security, some people put more weight on liberty. And you want to have people understand why they differ about things. They may have the same goals, but they go at it differently. And the idea was to get to become people, our students become civil with each other when they speak. So the second component was, of course, ethics. The third was just we wanted to make sure our students learn how to write well. So there's a very strong writing component. The fourth was leadership, how to function with an organization. It wasn't just being a leader, it's knowing your personality and knowing how to deal with people that have different personalities than you, so you become someone that people want to go to within the organization. And the final component was going to be the practicums. That is, you got to go out in the real world. So we have very robust intern programs. So those are the 5 components. And we start with an MPP. We have several joint degrees now related to that. We now have a Bachelor's of Art and Bachelor's of Science degree, which just started in January. And the MPA program is coming over to the Hobby School this fall. So that's where we are right now. We envision having many more joint degrees. I mean, policy schools are kind of like a vacuum for interdisciplinary partnerships in terms of training, because policy is everywhere. And so we envision, I think we have 13 joint degrees now. I can't remember all of them, to be honest with you. But we see ourselves evolving into that as we mature. And I think, LBJ, you've got, what, over 20, I believe, right?
Yeah, I think 18 to 20.
Yeah. But that's where we are right now. We have a Center for Public Policy still, which, again, gave birth to the school. We have also a ethics center, the Rockwell Center for Ethics. And we're working on developing a Center for Civic Engagement to put a place for our very robust intern programs. So that's where we are right now. We eventually envision a PhD program that will allow for us to train students to do, of course, PhD is about research training for the most part. And that's where we really push on the quantitative training that we push at the school at this point.
Terrific. Okay, great. So I've been on the job about 18 months. We have a Master's in Public Affairs, which was our foundational program, and I see some of our alums from the early days out in the audience. That program started approximately 53 years ago, and LBJ really wanted to create a place in Texas. And he was in a meeting, and he describes this in a founding speech. He was in a meeting in D.C., surrounded by people from Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and he had a degree from Texas Teachers College. And he wanted to make sure by the end of his life there was a place where Texans and other Southerners could get the same kind of training that those folks had so that they could govern, so that they could influence policy. And so that Master's in Public Affairs is that foundational degree. We added a Master's in Global Policy about 15 years ago in terms of planning. Our Master's in Public Affairs has about 100 students entering every year. Our Global Policy has about 60 students entering every year. And then we have an Executive Master's in Public Leadership. It's about 20 to 25 students. And then we have a PhD program. And one of my early projects as dean has been to propose an undergraduate degree in public affairs and try and convince my president, my provost, to fund it. And that's where I am right now, is in the persuasion mode. Our strengths in terms of subject matter kind of surprised me. I had been at UCLA's policy school for 24 years, and when I looked really closely, I discovered the LBJ school is really strong in national security and diplomacy. A lot of former Bush administration folks who were available and really interested in teaching. And so we have almost an entire, it's not a department, but we have about 11 or 12 faculty. And we have about that many faculty that do energy and the environment. And then we aspire to be sort of a full service school so that we cover the other areas. And, one of the things I've dealt with is about 50% of our senior faculty have retired, creating kind of room in the canopy for new growth. And so that's kind of an exciting moment to go back and think about LBJ's legislative legacy and values and how we can kind of renew our commitment to some of those through faculty hires. I think I'll stop with that.
Nobody cares about the story of the University of Washington, but I will say it's some blending. Right. And one of the things you'll hear when you talk to public policy programs around the country is that it's a little bit of a mix and match, in many ways very similar to the way governance happens in a federalist system. So some places have a little urban policy in it. Some people have some community organizing. Others have strengths in social policy. And it's not really been driven by anything other than the personalities, some of the founding stories, right, and the commitments that people brought from community, from government to the policy schools. And I think what's one of the reasons why I said yes to this request was we're at a place in the field where I feel like we're kind of adolescents. Mm-hmm. We've kind of all grown up in our own little communities. And now we've, dated a few people, but now we're going to college as a field. And we're hanging out with each other. And we're learning about the evolution of the field, talking deeply with people who are in practice, bringing people who have practical expertise and social science and design and other points of view into our programs. And it's a really wonderful, exciting time to be part of, I think, this field of higher education. So Jim, when you were talking a little bit about the hobby school, you talked about some of the ethical things that we're driving, and Mike, a little bit you alluded to with the founders and the ethical people who are at the kind of reason why your school was named. I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on, given the political moment that we find ourselves in, when there seems to be more separation between the far left and the far right, well, how do you think about leading a school that creates that ability? You were talking about to have civil dialogue and discussion. How important is that for you in the way you think about your leadership, the students, the curriculum? How is that topic settling with you right now?
I think it's very important because with Barbara Jordan, if you look at her ascendancy based on race and gender, you have to start in 1972. She was the first Black woman elected to Congress from Texas. 1974, I think she was up and coming, where she was showcased nationally with the Watergate legacy. And 1976, she was the first African-American woman to give a keynote address. And in that speech, she talked about who would speak for the common good. And if you go back and reflect on that speech, she addressed the issue of partisanship. And she made a clarion call to the party in that speech to put partisanship aside and wouldn't we love to have that today and a sense of civility? And I know that we had it here locally, and I see Judge Emmett, even on, it cuts both ways, regardless of whether you're Democrat or Republican, but his governance was a little different. And I think we should get back to those kinds of moments. Thank you.
In terms of training our students, the ethics component, I mean, it just, when we developed the business plan, again, the quantitative part was the dominant part, but we realized the ethics component had to be co-equal. And it is at the hobby school. We don't have a little spot for ethics or philosophy in the school. It's got a big spot. And again, there's two things that we focus on. One is, we'll focus on the values part first. You really can't separate data analysis from values. You can't. And you see a lot of results and a lot of studies in which there seems to be an emphasis on asserting a certain end. And that has to be understood by our students as they analyze these things. But the other part about ethics that's very important is that when you're going through a policy debate, what is the value that you're pushing here? And if someone's saying something you don't like, probe further. Find out, are you more concerned, again, the security issue or the equality issue? Are you, and why? And the other person who's on the other side goes, well, I'm pushing this. Come to an agreement on why you disagree instead of beating each other over the head. And we want all our students to be able to do that. So when they go out and when they take a job, they're able to think like that when they talk to people they disagree with. It's a plea for tolerance. The other part of ethics that I alluded to, the first thing I said, was ethics in research. Oftentimes you're not going to understand the study, but there's an ethics to how you analyze the data. Are you being transparent with your data? Are you going to allow people to replicate the data? These things, I mean, the National Science Foundation actually has a checklist on ethical research practices. They don't call it that, but it's part of what you have to do. You have to give your data up after a few years so people can use it. And so the point is, it's allowing for authentication, replication, and also accountability on the part of the scholars. And more often than not, someone that doesn't know anything about the subject matter can ask these very probing questions about how you gather the data, and they will know, without even knowing the subject matter, there's something wrong here.
So I think at the LBJ school, like these other schools, we tend to get students that come in that think of themselves as policy advocates to begin with. And our goal in the education of those students is to elevate their conception of themselves so they think of themselves as public leaders and able to facilitate public discourse amongst individuals that hold really polarized views and in this day and age are not practiced at speaking with each other and understanding each other's why. Mm-hmm. And I think there are a variety of ways that you can try and facilitate exposing students to different points of view. It helps a lot if you have a diverse student body in terms of political ideology. And I'll be honest that one of the LBJ school, there's a tyranny of the majority sometimes, and there's that threat, and that majority is the progressive majority. And so I have conservative students that are interested, they're active military, they're national intelligence, they're focused on other professional identities, law enforcement, homeland security. That creates the community that needs to talk to each other and practice respecting one another and understanding each other's why. And it's challenging. I think our DEI officer spends more time mediating and making sure our conservative students feel like they belong than they actually do almost anything else. And there's an irony there, I think, given the sort of the broader state conversation about that. But then we will go to great lengths in terms of programming to bring in different points of view. Mm-hmm. So, we had an event that featured George Will and Karl Rove on the future of conservatism. And the Twitter sphere could not get over that this was held at the LBJ school. But if you think about, LBJ's legacy, he didn't care where those votes came from. And invariably, many of them were going to come from Republicans. And it was whatever it took to get that bipartisan outcome, because that was what he needed. And so we're trying to lean back into that approach. But I think, you have to talk about it with students. You have to kind of literally say, I understand that this is where you are and what you're feeling right now in terms of your professional career. We want to broaden that. We want you to become a public leader and be able to facilitate these conversations. And then give them experiences where they get to test themselves in those environments.
Do both of you feel like that's true of your student body as well? It's surprising to me, actually, to hear that conservative students you don't feel like you have a lot of conservative students at the LBJ school.
Well, I should mention that Dean Mark Welsh was invited, and and he couldn't be here today, unfortunately, because of some personal circumstances that were unanticipated. But I can remember within my first 3 weeks, I had a student come in and say, I'm thinking of transferring to the Bush School because I'm conservative, and it's not the faculty, it's not the teaching assistants, it's the other students. They're making me feel like I don't belong. And I sat down and I said, you belong. We're gonna make sure that you bring me your friends who also don't feel like they belong, and let's find out what we can do about that.
How about the two of you?
Yeah, I'll respond to that. I often tell my students I don't teach an ideology, I don't teach a party, I teach a subject. Right? And even now, thanks to Renee, I got one of my students assigned to work with Wesley Hunt, who is a Republican, for example. And some of my graduates, they work for Republicans. Some of them are consultants or what have you. And so I think you have to have a mixture. And even at an HBCU, you can have diversity and difference of opinions.
I'll just add one small thing. So I teach, and one of the things I'll ask my students right at the beginning, and I think a couple of my students are actually here, I say, suppose you're wrong, how would you test for it? To kind of give them a jolt to say, these preconceived notions, maybe you're wrong. And you have to go look at what the other side is saying to get true understanding.
The origins of many of these schools was during this time where there was a belief that we can go into information, uncover facts through rigorous means. And it was a time of optimism, right? A time of people feeling like there is a collective set of things that we could achieve. And so how do you try to navigate a very different environment, again, with your faculty, with your students, around this facts and values, which again are kind of woven through the fabric of these schools?
Well, any reasoned argument in terms of you have to look at the facts, but everyone could have their sides in terms of their value judgment and how they line up on that. But at the end of the day, a reasoned argument will be able to persuade or win someone over to your side. And so it should be factually driven in terms of the argument, but also we shouldn't dispute someone's values in terms of what your values are, or whatever it is, because we live in a society where government is based upon the authoritative allocation of values, all right? And the values preserved, we should accept that, for example, and live with the policy implications of it. If you don't like it, you work to change it.
That's right. We're not in the business of advocacy for policy school. We're in the business of trying to get understanding and educate. And so we do a variety of studies. And sometimes people on the left get mad at us, and sometimes people on the right get mad at us. And we know we're doing well when we're taking fire from either side, given the results of the study. And what you can be partisan about is the methodology, how you conduct the research design, how you conduct the study. Poke holes in that. And if we get it wrong, we'll make changes. But you're trying to be an entity. All of us are trying to be entities that try and help create further understanding on some issue that's of importance to all of us.
It's well stated.
So I agree with my two colleagues over here. I think that, Jodi, to respond to your question, though, I think we all want evidence-based arguments for policy change and policy development. I think in this day and age, what has gotten more challenging is we're in a democracy, and again, going back to this idea of the tyranny of the majority, we need to be connected to one another so that we can persuade each other, and we can present evidence, and we can talk about values, and we can try and understand why a person holds the views and the positions that they do. And I think that we've reached a point, maybe because of social media and the way that our political culture has evolved, and it's kind of gotten down to, the community level where we're so polarized we don't actually talk to each other. We're not connected anymore. And I had a community organizer come and talk to our students, and to paraphrase her views on how you build these dialogues. I mean, and I'm not going to use the same monikers that she used, but basically, if you don't know someone who's woke, if you don't know someone who's racist, sexist, an election denier, your social circle isn't big enough to bring about change. And that's a challenging position. that is for those of us that want to stay in our bubble, and we know who our friends are and we know what their political views are, and there's sort of a status game of, who can be the most conservative or who can be the most liberal. Having that worldview is challenging, and it's hard, but it connects us, right? And I feel like coming into Texas in the last 2 years, and now meeting legislators, I've spent a lot of time in the last week and a half just meeting legislators, I realized that we're not connected. We're not talking to each other. We don't know each other. And I think, the facts matter and values matter, but if we're so fragmented, I think that part of democracy where we get to persuade each other isn't happening.
Welcome.
Welcome.
So David, we'll let you settle in. I'm Jodi Sandfort. I'm moderating this fine conversation.
Thank you.
We'll let you take a sip of water, and I'll throw out another question. In the discussion we're having, gentlemen, I'm curious about, as you think about the things we need to have broadened scope for, what are some of the most important policy issues for the state of Texas right now?
Oh, where do I start? Education is there. And here locally, we've been grappling with education in terms of public education. And the way I like to frame that, the approach, I think I would call it a kind of accountability issue in terms of where do you place the blame, for example. And I think it's wide enough to go around, and you can't blame the legislature in terms of whether or not they want vouchers or whether policy they support, or if you have to look at the local board of trustees and the parents. And so education to me is a big one, and I think there should be some accountability at all levels and all parties, because that, and as we say, we blame as college professors that it's the high schools, and the high schools blame the middle schools in terms of the products that we get. But there are some major issues when we live in a state, and when there are districts, for example, and if they're underperformance, they can't do college work. They will not be able to graduate on time. And also as a workforce that the state will depend on, for example, it will not be an educated workforce in terms of being able to grow and expand the state in and of itself. So education is a big one. I'll stop there, Jim. You maybe
I think Governor Hobby said a few years ago, he said, the problems I faced 40 years ago, we still face today. And it's education, it's healthcare. I threw in energy, transitions we're going through there. I think law enforcement, criminal justice is another issue. Obviously, those are just four that come to mind. And every state in the country is facing this. In fact, the country's facing this, right? So the states are the labs for all that. But the thing I think we need to emphasize most is the human capital part. And I think Michael is saying this. It's education and healthcare. Those are two things allowing a citizen of the state of Texas, or a human being in the state of Texas, has access to the training they need to become successful in life. But also, if they get sick, for no fault of their own, there's a place they fall back on where they don't lose everything.
So again, I agree with my colleagues. I get the benefit of going third. I think Texas is growing rapidly, and our public financing system is not designed to keep up with that growth in terms of having the funding that is needed to meet new demand for social services, for education, for transportation, for energy. Our focus on property taxes and the way that we're managing our public finance in the property tax system it's going to leave our public agencies at the state, county, and the local levels with increasingly fewer resources than they had before, even while demand for those services and protections are going up. And so I think that's a structural thing that puts pressure across these policy domains that have been identified.
So welcome, Ambassador.
Thank you.
We began with people just explaining a bit about the schools that they are leading and just the history or the legacy. So if you could say a bit about the Baker Institute at Rice University, that would be lovely.
Baker Institute was founded as a result of vision by a professor at Rice in '92 who wrote a letter which attracted Jim Baker, then newly out of office in the beginning of '92, to the idea of a public policy institute on the Rice campus. Baker was seized with the idea, and in the period '93 to '94, the institute was set up. And Baker based the founding tenets of the institute, which still obtain, as nonpartisan, not bipartisan, but rigorously nonpartisan, evidence-based, which literally means research, policy recommendations based upon facts and defensible upon the facts. A policy product written in a way that decision makers at a local, state, national, or international level could absorb. We were not to become another institution, I won't name any names here, where one of 200 authors writes for the other 199 people who claim they understand what the author is writing when the real purpose is to enhance a tenure track resume or a publication resume. It's writing for understanding, it's writing for decision makers. So it's not just what we do, it's how we do it. And then finally, we are not an academic institution. We don't grant degrees, although our fellows do participate, many of them, in a degree program, a Master's in Global Affairs, that's been offered for some years now by Rice University. But we're not the degree issuing entity. We have fellows, we do not have faculty, and there is no tenure track. So that's who we are. What we do is focused on areas where we have, used to call it a comparative advantage, I like value added, which is energy studies. And that means energy in every aspect of the subject you can imagine. When the grid failed in Texas after Ira, we were asked to assess what had happened and to write a protocol to avoid it happening again, which we did. When wind energy, solar energy, classic alternative sources are assessed, we do the calculus, market, infrastructure, technology, that comes up with what's needed in terms of public policy or market changes or infrastructure to make these alternative classic sources profitable. But we also do high-end, turquoise, green, hydrogen, some of the more cutting-edge, low-carbon hydrocarbons, and the markets for carbon capture, sequestration, carbon valuation, all of that. And we do it on a national level, we do it on a Texas level, a Houston, Galveston, Gulf Coast level, and we do it on an international level. We have written the model for German energy requirements. It's the only one out there. The government of France has asked us to do one for France, which we will shortly. Everything we do is public facing. It's not private work. So that's what we do, areas we concentrate in. Beyond energy, we do infrastructure and a review of transportation infrastructure, how to more intelligently plan, revise, upgrade infrastructure, something certainly not needed here in Harris County at all. You have the most efficient water drainage system I've ever seen. I've never been in a state that thought to use its major highways as drainage canals. That is an extraordinary engineering feat here as someone coming from outside. We do public finance and taxation policy, religion in public life, presidential elections in consort with the Carter Center in Atlanta. And we do U.S.-Mexico relations, trade, assessment of Mexican government policies. We're one of only 3 institutions in North America doing that, which is surprising. And we do health and biosciences, where our comparative advantage or value added is the association with Texas Medical Center, of course. That's who we are, that's what we do.
Thank you. And so when I asked the question when you walked in about the important policy issues in the state of Texas, how would you answer that question?
Education, absolutely. Healthcare. Texas ranks last in any number of categories amongst the 50 states for critical healthcare indicators. Most notably, and a topic we focus on at the Institute, maternal and neonatal mortality and morbidity. When you dig deep down and truly are able to compare apples to apples, where you eliminate lifestyle, other factors that get you different results, and you compare literally Texas to other states using exactly the same criteria, Texas still comes in last. And there are many reasons for this, but it is fundamentally access to health care. The bill for Texans is enormous. The bill could be relieved by a very simple priority policy recommendation, which is Medicaid expansion. But for the same reasons that educational policies are adopted in Austin as they are, Medicaid expansion has not yet been adopted. But we hope the model just followed within the last few days by North Carolina, where the state ran the numbers and did not find it affordable to sustain hospitals in areas outside of cities and suburban areas. Rural North Carolina was losing its hospitals. They were turning into medical deserts. They're in a state which also has centers of excellence in medical care. So we look at the problem, we assess it in a fact-based manner, and we produce a cogent public policy recommendation. We also work on firearm violence. Texas is not the worst state in the country. There are states which suffer more incidents of firearm violence. This is not a Second Amendment issue as we look at it. It's an epidemiological issue. And what is needed from retailers, from marketers, and from law enforcement.
So I want to kind of give you a little bit of opportunity to catch up on some of the conversation we were having. Given the work of the Institute, I understand that you don't grant degrees, but are there particular skill sets or competencies that you think when the students in the Masters of Global Affairs at Rice connect with your
Sure.
team, are there particular competencies or skills that you really try
Absolutely.
to stress?
Macroeconomics. If you cannot understand basic market economics, if you can't read Financial Times or Wall Street Journal for understanding, then you're going to find it very difficult to deal in any aspect of foreign policy, foreign affairs, political science, or public administration. It is vital to have, if it's only that 1 year, 2 semester courses in macro, it's absolutely essential. We apply both quantitative and qualitative analytical methods to what we do with the master's degree, which is to say there is substantive reading. It isn't purely reading about the way to interpret what you read, and we'll leave it to you if you ever want to read anything about those facts, names, places, histories, things that actually happened. But we also do the analytical method behind all of it. And we focus on the practical and the pragmatic, which is indeed public policy. What happens in Texas and in Houston reflects in a way that is not unique but extraordinary international and national events. That's the character of Houston. It matters to Houston what is going on in Ukraine, in China, in Pacific, in Latin America, in energy trade, in other key commodity trades. It matters greatly. And so this program is designed to graduate students with the ability to interpret those things, to occupy positions in public life or in the private sector, where that background will help them understand and try to find solutions.
Well, since you just arrived, you don't know this, but you'll have to trust me. There's a lot of commonality, actually, among the members on this panel. And so a question that I was wondering is, are there opportunities, policy areas, or workforce development needs, or things where there may be opportunities for collaboration across the universities?
Absolutely.
What are your thoughts about that?
I'll start with me. I think we're already doing that. For many years, we were in our own silos, and we partnered with Jim. We've been doing surveys. Also, I think in terms of workforce, internships, both public and private. And as I mentioned earlier, Renee, we work as a team. If there are internship opportunities, we make referrals. And I think also in terms of the state of the discipline, in terms of where we are, it would be useful to do a comprehensive survey to say what the needs are in terms of public administration and some of the challenges facing public servants, for example. And well, I'm not going to say this in terms of the survey, but I think one of the biggest problems that I see is the lack of knowledge about basic sound American government or how the political system works for some of the incoming master level students. And I know in the Gen Ed courses, you have to take American government and Texas government, but all of our students are not political science majors when they come in. And I think that will give them some understanding of the theoretical analysis of the history of government, so we will not be so polarized about these issues, whether it's about immigration. And if you look at the world in terms of how it unfolds, is that we're all connected. And there's a sense of civility, and you will know if you lose an election that there should be a peaceful transition in office and you leave. Thank you.
What he said. So we do have these partnerships, but they tend not to be permanent. And so we've had partnerships with Rice. We used to do Steve Kleinberg's survey for years. That's one, but they tend not to last. They tend not to be permanent. And so, in addition, there's other ways you can try and do it. Like we have a summer training institute and something called EITM, which is a fairly technical thing, which merges mathematical modeling and applied statistics. And you merge the two because they tend to be taught separately to the detriment of the results and accumulation. So we've had that National Science Foundation funded that. We've been doing that for years. And that we bring in scholars from around the country. We bring in students from around the country. So that's one way to try and build these partnerships. But again, it's not permanent. So locally, we could probably do things like figure ways to have courses cross-listed. I mean, it might be a stretch from going to Houston to Austin, although I did have a couple students go and take courses in Austin. It's quite a long ride, but they did it. But with the advance of technology, with the hybrid training we're starting to do, I think that's now doable. I think we can harness technology, create these partnerships. And let me put a plug in for the Volcker Alliance, too. The Volcker Alliance has gotten, that's a bad choice of English, has developed a what we call a partnership with several universities. I mean, Jodi, JR, myself, we are part of this, but we're part of it too. And you've got universities from around, I mean, everywhere. And we have a Dean's Summit. We meet twice a year. And with that, we've got, several people on the screen from all over the place, from Berkeley to Ohio State, I mean, Duke, North Carolina, pick a place. They're all there talking about, and we all complain about the same things, but it's a way of talking about how we're dealing with various problems that we're all facing. So that's another thing that be done. Again, technology helps there, but God bless the Volcker Alliance for getting us to talk to each other.
What both of them said, and added, the Baker Institute historically was a ship on its own bottom, not just with respect to other institutions here in Houston or Texas, but Rice itself. We had our own programming. We did our own thing. We were perfectly happy, thank you, at doing that. That's really not an adequate way to enhance the work we do or to help the community in which we find ourselves. And it's a national as well as a local community. So we are, in a structured fashion, reaching out. We started here with UH and with the World Affairs Council and the Houston International Council on Foreign Relations. all of which have been good partners. But we've also been to UT Austin, which I discovered had not been a regular structured engagement, to help some of my former colleagues work on their classes up there in government, in intelligence. And we will be reaching out to A&M as well to try to bring in the major schools. In terms of Texas Southern, we'd very much like to see what can be done with a particular focus on what you said, Michael, which is how does government actually work?
Right.
Not what's in the textbook. As a practical matter, how does the budgetary process work? How does national security work across agencies? What's the role of the president, the White House, the NSC? You can't find it in books. But yes, we are reaching out as well. We're trying to make it a more enduring kind of relationship than has been the case in the past. And of course, to Rice as well.
Yeah, I think I'm here to actually explore the answer to just that question. How might we collaborate? And I think the expansion of Medicaid is critically important. Would love to think about how we could partner on that.
Heavily engaged.
Love the idea of a county and city survey of government officials. We just did a survey of elections administrators here in Texas to understand the challenges they face on the front line of democracy. But clearly, doing a broader assessment, I think, would provide us with a lot of valuable information about how to strengthen collective efforts. So, many of us have capstone projects in small groups. We could think about, I don't know what the logistical challenges are, but we could think about having our students work with each other, potentially on some of those projects. There also, one of the things I've learned just sitting here listening is that the different areas of strength in terms of centers and institutes within the schools and the Baker Institute, because we all have different areas of expertise, but some relatively more strong than others, and looking for the complementarities there, I think is really helpful.
I want to ask one question and then open it up to some questions from the audience. So as somebody who's not Texan, I was really struck that these institute schools bear the names of these iconic Texan leaders, all of whom are incredibly pragmatic and really committed to evidence, right? Which is, again, the theme I'm hearing from all of you. And so I guess just what is that legacy that you have the opportunity to protect in this state? Because you're not named after nobody, right? You're named after really important people to the history of the country and one could argue the world. So what's the responsibility in this moment in time to Texans and to the state?
I think you're correct. If you were to list the top officials in the world in terms of reflection, these schools are named after some of the greatest legacies that we've seen ever produced. And I think the common thread, it's a sense of humanitarianism. And I think they were all concerned, and as someone mentioned, that LBJ he just wanted to vote. But I think clearly they were committed to people having a voice in terms of their vote, and also having an impact on the world. As we talk about a Baker Institute, I hadn't talked about Mickey Leland, but this is someone who lost his life on a humanitarian mission. So I think humanitarianism is the common thread that I think that runs through all of these icons that these schools are named after. Thank you.
Governor Hobby is the most get-to-the-point person I've ever met in my life. I mean, and so getting to know an elected official at that level, so you're glad he was minding the store. I would say that. And the other thing about him was because he had that attitude towards policy, he would work with anybody. I mean, so I've had several people over the years who are Republicans will talk about him just glowing terms because he appointed people that were not the same party as him to positions of authority.
It's how we used to govern,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? We
yeah,
need
yeah,
that dialogue.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and you think about his family. I mean, Evita Kalpavi was in the Eisenhower administration, even though she was a Democrat. I mean, and she was Eisenhower and her were very good friends. In fact, here's something else about her. President Eisenhower had a couple favorites he wanted to succeed him as president. Evita Kalpavi was one of them. In the first, a woman. And this is in the 50s. But again, that pragmatism, they wanted to help the state. That was it. We just want to make things better for people. And his book is called How Things Really Work. And basically the book is a testament to his experiences, but there's this pragmatic thread through the whole thing.
And I'll share a story. I'll never forget, it was the year 2000, and it was doing the redistricting process for the city of Houston. So I think Dave Feldman, who was the city attorney, he wanted representation because the city council wanted. So there was somebody from Texas Southern, I was that person. And Governor Harvey was there, and I think Bob Stein was there. And the pitch was for us to do a study. And Governor Harvey said, "What are you going to pay?" He said, $1,000. He said, "Oh, hell no." and I didn't know my value and my work, but I know I wasn't going to be on a study with Governor Harvey and get paid $1,000. I think the upshot, we got $20,000 for that. So I will never forget that. He was straight and to the point.
Well, Jim Baker would tell you I'm a Republican and I'm a Texan, but I'm concerned and have been concerned all my life with the U.S., its interests and development, and what needs to happen in the world to support and sustain that development. U.S. cannot exist in isolation from the world, nor the world in isolation from the United States. And Texas is a key part of all of that. The administrations that he worked with and for, and at times partially led, the man who ran Washington is not an exaggeration, were marked by pragmatism, by attention to strategy, to the long game, to patience, strategic patience, and above all, to avoiding the trap of easy rhetoric, demagoguery, and appeal to lowest common denominators. They ran during the H.W. Bush administration, 41, the tightest administrative ship in my 45 years recollection. And it was a model for those who came after, a model not followed, or it followed only imperfectly, but it did represent the attempt to advance American interests through a prudent, cogent, strategic policy that in the end was not Republican or Democratic in its character. It was nonpartisan for a Republican.
I think a lot of our leaders, some pragmatic, some more visionary, were really concerned with the destiny of our democracy and have constantly challenged us to live up to the promise of those values. And I think Robert Jordan said that and much more eloquently than I just did many times. But I think and I think policy schools are constantly asking ourselves, what is the promise of a democracy? What are the flaws in a democracy? And how can we lead our communities forward? And I think each of our namesakes gives us a different story about their vision for how to do that. And I think we all appeal to that strategically when we need to. But I think we represent a very rich collection of efforts. And I think your question kind of brings them together. And we can look at that collection of leaders as a whole, all Texans who, had a great vision to offer us and a great challenge to each of us as leaders of policy communities, and our students, right? So I'm not sure that there's an easy answer, but I think each one of them challenges us.
As I listen to you, I keep on wondering something that I think about all the time, which is what plagues us now actually conflict of values? Or is it a lack of a common knowledge base around the fundamentals of democracy? I do not know. I think reasonable people in the history, including the leaders that your schools represent, can differ on policy positions and values. But I've been in so many dialogues with people from very different points of view, and I realize we have so much in common that often gets obscured. Particularly in a situation when we are focused, I think, as all of you are talking about, on pragmatic solutions to what faces us. We have just a few minutes to have some dialogue from the floor, and then our vision is we're going to go in and have some food and drink and more dialogue and discussion so that we don't have to have this so formalized. But I'm curious if there's thoughts or questions that you'd like to have everybody engage in here on the panel. Sir.
So I was raised on a farm. Crops don't pay. I no farm. And so when I went to the LBJ schools, I don't think there was a single course even remotely relating to nonprofits. I spent most of my time the last several years leading volunteer groups out at the food bank. I was out there today. And if there was something we have a need for in this country, it's for some young people. They may not make as much money, but for people that can step in. I mean, the food bank is a huge operation. 90% of the work is by volunteers, but there's a paid staff of almost 300, and it's a business. And yet, especially now with COVID funds ending March 1st, they're really suffering. And I'm like, what are the schools looking at for people that might have that particular type of interest?
Can I just respond in big pictures? So when I was talking earlier about the field of public policy and how it had evolved, I don't know when you graduated from the LBJ school, but I bet it was when it was a little baby child.
I was in the 3rd class.
So one of the evolutions of the field nationally has been in the last 30 years, I would say, an integration of nonprofit management, civil society, that kind of thing, because the food shelf is one example and there are infinite ones. And I think the tradition of governance in this country is really the integration of civil society, nonprofits, and government and private sector working together on some of these problems. So for those of you who have schools and graduate programs, what I'm saying probably resonates.
Absolutely. And the LBJ school has had now for about 15 years the RGK Center. It's the largest endowed center in the school. It's focused on philanthropy and nonprofit management, and it has a Connect program which connects our students with about 35 nonprofits every year that have a technical or a managerial skill deficit that the student can fill. And we fund them to go out and have that experience. So nonprofits are a complement really to the public sector's efforts to serve society, I think.
Anyone else want to comment on
The
that?
Next Gen program actually contributed to that as well. It's kind of like a tripartite internship experience in terms of public sector, nonprofit, and even business, all right, to create a different profile of public servant. Yeah.
And we have a summer internship program. It's called Social Economy, in which our students are working for nonprofits and they help develop business plans for them. So they're right on the ground with them. So we do that as well, in addition to some of the things these folks are talking about.
And I think many of our schools do that both to train the students, but then also to help bring some of that wonderful young knowledge base to help people solve problems. So in the doing of the programs, people are getting that pragmatic skill development that I think we were talking about earlier. Yes, ma'am.
Following your comment, and I'm very curious what y'all would think about, but we talk about all the time, how maybe the draft needs to be reinstated with a, work thing. With that, do you think, because you have people that are thinking about this, do you think that would have any not the draft particularly, but a service, so that people would be coming together in some type of boot camp where as Steve said, you've got to know everybody. You've got to really talk to them and understand what they were doing. I mean, I'm wondering what y'all think about that, because we're not talking to each other. I mean, we're not listening to what each other is saying. Just curious. I mean, I pose that as you've got this expert panel here, so.
So a year of service, volunteerism.
I'll take it from a different angle. There is not a chief of staff of the U.S. Army in the last 20 years of my knowledge who has not been increasingly concerned at the separation of the U.S. military. I speak of the Army, but it applies to the other services in lesser degree, from the bulk of the American population. That leads to a separation in policy making and the cost value ratio in policy making when it's your son and daughter from all classes of society. Because if you did this, if you even attempted it, it would have to be like the last years of the Vietnam draft without exemptions. You could not run it in any other fashion, or you'd have the same problems that the 60s and the 60 through 69 marked the Vietnam draft. But what you have now is there's no cost to huge sections of the population. Sacrifices are invisible. If it is across the spectrum of society, you not only get the benefit of commonality of service, but you also get a realization at all levels of society and decision makers, the parents, of what the costs are, the human costs of what they're doing. And that's a good thing all the way around. And I'll defer to others on the public service, non-military side, but from a strict military foreign policy standpoint, it would be a very, very good thing indeed.
Yeah, I think you can approach it from a curricular standpoint and also some other innovative techniques. We do service learning in some of the classes. You can embed that in our undergraduate public affairs program. But I've also proposed to the university, and if they don't fund it, I will seek outside funding for it. If you know some funders, let me know, is to create a service learning and civic engagement academy, and where we could allow students to take certain courses and we could track them. We have an issue with persistence in graduation, for example, and I think if we could keep them and see them progress through such an academy, they would persist and they would graduate on time, but also they would have a badge at the end of the day in terms of service. And so that's something I would like to implement at Texas Southern University. Okay.
So we have these granular things that we could do, but you're saying something national, correct?
I'm saying bigger than that.
Yeah, so you're thinking
Back to where we.
Like the Peace Corps.
commonality.
AmeriCorps,
Yeah.
AmeriCorps.
We have
I
AmeriCorps.
mean, in the 80s, Senator Paul Simon from Illinois had a bill. He was pushing a national service.
Yep.
I think it was for a year, correct?
Mhm. That's exactly
it was
right.
Instead of serving in the military, you'd serve, and it was everybody.
A CCC,
Yeah.
WPA
Yeah.
style, but national and effectively mandatory.
And you have to have it mandatory, because
Yeah.
that's the whole point of this time.
Called a gap year on steroids.
Yeah.
Well, but you know, those Europeans go wandering around the world and stuff, that's their gap. Because they're, I'm talking about really, I think that would bring another, where you have where you know where everybody is. I mean, where there's a conversation that's going to be.
Well, and part of the idea of both the mandatory military service, but the year of service is you're talking about, then there are societal consequences, right, of that kind of experience. And I think there are a lot of the universities that I'm talking to, people are thinking a lot about what is the consequence of a university orientation where we have focused so much on the economic benefit for individuals coming out of a four-year degree rather than the public responsibility that also comes with being elitely educated in a four-year degree. And so there's a lot of this, and I think strategies, but I haven't heard people talking about this on a big policy level at the national level.
Well, I
So
was thinking about having the people in the fancy universities actually meeting with the people that are.
Absolutely.
funding degrees.
Absolutely.
Degrees, which
One final question, gentlemen.
So you mentioned a lot of great ideas for what you guys want to do, especially collaborating. But the one thing that all of that has in common is they all cost money. So how do you convince, which the way that it kind of works, how do you convince the legislature to say, hey, take a stab at really, really funding, especially with the opportunity of the surplus, really, really funding research universities and these programs for student success, so that you guys can actually get together and produce these big ideas? How do you convince them that now is the time for you to double down on your investment in higher education and really give the resources that we need, not only at you guys, but us as students, to succeed and, make the change that we want you want us to see us make?
Do you believe it takes money?
Well, that's a different question. I mean, I think the answer to your question goes back to what Jodi said earlier in the context of, I think a lot of the American public, a lot of families have lost trust in universities and in the academy. And I think to regain that trust, we have to give back to our communities more directly than we do. And so I think the resources would follow if that trust was improved. But if universities are there just to enrich the individuals, and there are these legacy effects, and it's only certain groups that benefit, society isn't seen to benefit broadly, it's easy to withdraw that public support from the universities, right? If you think about the GI Bill and how transformational that was, there was tremendous faith in the idea that sending these men and women back to college was going to help the country develop and grow and future families. We've lost that trust that going to college would have that effect. And I think as academic leaders, it's our responsibility, and it's all of our responsibilities to rethink what that educational experience does for us and does for our community. And I think community engagement is a big piece of it.
Any other comments on this?
On to his question, I think in terms of, you asked about the difficulty in terms of getting the legislature to buy in. All right. Well, it depends. I think it's much easier for the R1 research institutions in terms of driving that. It's not a problem. But still, the overall, if you look at the current session, and there's been an ongoing opinion in terms of what members of the legislature sometimes think about universities and what we do. And tenure questions, you can put that out there. So it's kind of difficult to convince them that real work takes place at a university in an academic environment. That's for their lack of understanding. I would put the onus on them. But it depends. You can get some buy-in. For example, I think Governor Abbott is on the same page with the President of the United States if money is going to come into the state in terms of the computer chips, creating an industry for the state of Texas to create jobs and to grow. It depends on what the ask is, I would put it. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to invite you to thank our panelists for this evening's conversation. And then would really invite you to stay to have informal conversations with the audience and with everyone else. The reception is through that door, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.